He was shoved hard into the back of a squad car, wrists chafing against cold metal cuffs. Two officers smirked at each other, laughing under their breath. They didn't care about his ID. They didn't care about his rights. To them, he was just another black man who fit the description. But what they didn't know, what would come back to haunt them, was that the man they humiliated on the sidewalk, the one they mocked and arrested in front of a crowd, would one day return. Not in protest. Not in anger. But seated behind a judge's bench, with their fate in his hands. Hey there, and welcome back to Talecraft, the channel where stories of resilience, justice, and poetic redemption come alive. If this is your first time here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because we promise one thing. We don't just tell stories, we craft them. And today's story? It's one that flips the script in a way no one saw coming. Let me ask you something. What would you do if the very people who tried to break you ended up standing in front of you, helpless? Today's tale is not fiction. It's a mirror, and it reflects a powerful truth. The story begins with a man, calm, educated, well-dressed, just trying to get through his day. But two officers, riding high on bias and unchecked authority, stopped him with no reason. No warrant. No warning. They didn't ask questions, they just assumed. And in that moment they did more than abuse their power. They woke a giant. Because this man wasn't just a victim. He was a student of the law. A builder of justice. And every insult hurled, every right violated, was being recorded, not just by bystanders but by his mind. Every second became fuel. Now imagine fast-forwarding a few years. The courtroom is packed. The two officers now sit where the accused sit, facing charges of corruption, discrimination, and abuse of power. But they aren't concerned at first. After all, the system always protected them, right? That is, until the judge walks in. And as they lift their eyes, confusion turns to horror. Because the man behind the bench, the one in the black robe, is the same one they cuffed, degraded, and dismissed all those years ago. And now he holds the gavel. And he remembers everything. This is more than a story of revenge. It's a story of restraint, of how real power doesn't shout. It waits. It prepares. And then it changes everything. Throughout this video you'll witness how a man who could have sought payback chose something far more powerful. Justice with dignity. So grab your seat, settle in, and let's step into a story where the tables don't just turn, they flip. Because when justice comes full circle, it doesn't knock. It walks in silently, and everyone stands. It was a calm spring morning. Sunlight spilled between buildings and the city buzzed with quiet routine. He had just stepped out of a coffee shop, black suit, clean tie, and briefcase in hand, heading to a community legal clinic where he volunteered every Saturday. Just as he reached for his car door, red and blue lights flashed behind him. A patrol car skidded into the curb. Two white officers stepped out quickly, hands near their holsters. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," one barked. Confused but composed, he raised his hands slowly. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The problem was his skin. "You match a suspect," Officer Briggs said. No explanation. No real description. Just a vague statement. The man calmly reached into his coat pocket to retrieve his wallet. "My name is Malcolm Ellis. I'm an attorney," but that didn't matter. In an instant, the other officer, Daniels, grabbed Malcolm's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him against the hood. "Resisting?" Daniels sneered. "You people always make it harder on yourselves." A crowd started to form. Phones came out. Some people yelled, "He didn't do anything." But no one stepped in. Malcolm was cuffed and shoved into the cruiser like cargo. Inside the car, Malcolm's breath slowed. His chest burned, not just from the metal digging into his wrists but from something deeper. Humiliation. Disbelief. Fury. But he said nothing. As the car pulled away, he glanced back at the street. A small boy watched silently, holding his mother's hand. Their eyes met for just a second, one filled with pain, the other with confusion. At the station, Malcolm was booked. Fingerprinted. Placed in a holding cell with no answers. No charges. Hours passed. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Then, without ceremony, he was released. No apology. No paperwork. Just, "You're free to go." Malcolm stood outside the precinct for a long while, letting the reality settle over him like rain. In one morning, everything he stood for, justice, fairness, logic, was twisted and spat on by two men with badges and no conscience. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He remembered. Every face. Every word. Every second. The irony was crushing. A man who had sworn to defend the law, now violated by it. But something else happened in that silence. Something stronger than rage. A decision. He wouldn't run from the pain. He'd use it. And he'd make sure they never forgot his face. What Briggs and Daniels didn't know was that Malcolm had always walked a fine line. He had grown up in neighborhoods where respect had to be earned quickly and where silence could be mistaken for weakness. But his mother, a schoolteacher, had taught him better. Keep your mind sharp and your name clean. And that's what he did. Graduated top of his class. Earned his law degree from Harvard. Dedicated his life to civil rights work, quietly, diligently. He knew the law like scripture. But that morning reminded him, knowing the law wasn't enough. You had to wear it like armor. Back at his apartment, Malcolm sat at his desk, still wearing the suit he had been arrested in. He began writing, not a complaint but a journal entry. He documented every detail, time of day, sequence of words, badge numbers. It wasn't just evidence. It was fuel. Days later he filed a formal civil complaint, not because he believed it would change them but because it started something inside him. He increased his hours at the clinic. Took on pro bono cases involving police misconduct. Traveled. Lectured. Taught. In every room he reminded people that silence protects no one. And dignity, once stolen, can be rebuilt into something unbreakable. Years passed. And as Malcolm built his name, his reputation, and his courtroom presence, those officers remained unchanged. Still patrolling, still profiling, still assuming the law was a weapon they could wield without consequence. They never thought about the man they once dragged from the sidewalk. Not even when the corruption scandal broke. Not even when they were indicted. But they would soon remember. Because justice, real justice, has a long memory. And Malcolm's face was about to become unforgettable. Malcolm didn't change overnight. He wasn't fueled by revenge, he was powered by something more dangerous to oppressors. Focus. After that arrest, he poured every waking hour into justice. He turned his pain into a sharpened blade, not to harm but to carve a new path. In legal aid offices, courtrooms, and classrooms, Malcolm's name started circulating. He was calm, brilliant, and unshakable. He never mentioned what had been done to him. He didn't need to. He let his work speak louder than any courtroom outburst. With each case he won, he didn't just clear names, he made systems tremble. Quietly, relentlessly he rose. He was appointed as a state prosecutor within 2 years, an aggressive move for someone with his background. But the people saw something in him. Not just intelligence. Not just fire. But restraint. Discipline. The kind of man who could balance justice and mercy without losing himself to either. He prosecuted officers who abused power, but he also worked with police reform task forces, building bridges in places where none had existed. He was invited to speak at universities. His story, still untold in public, resonated in the way he carried himself. Strong. Composed. Dignified. Malcolm Ellis wasn't just changing the game. He was rewriting it. Soon the governor noticed. So did a few federal judges. His casework was clean, his name untouchable. When a seat opened in the district court, Malcolm was on the shortlist. By the time the nomination was announced, no one questioned it. The hearing was smooth. Bipartisan support flooded in. Even former opponents respected him. He had no scandals, no shortcuts. Just earned respect. One senator said, "He reminds us what the robe should stand for." And when he finally took the bench, his robe wasn't just fabric, it was armor. Malcolm had made it. But fate wasn't done with him yet. It started with a file on his desk. A routine case buried under dozens. He skimmed the charges. 2 officers accused of falsifying evidence, unlawful detainment, and racial profiling. He almost moved it aside, until he saw the names. Officer Briggs. Officer Daniels. Time froze. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. The same men. The same cruelty. For a moment, the room went silent. Then came the question, recuse himself, or face them? Malcolm closed the file. He wouldn't walk away. Not this time. They would get a fair trial. But they'd also get something else, truth. Delivered from the bench they never expected. The day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed. The defendant strolled in, smug. They still hadn't recognized him. Malcolm entered last in his black robe and took his seat. Then it happened. Briggs looked up and froze. Daniels nudged him, confused, until he looked too. Their faces drained of color. Their smirks vanished. Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his glasses and began the proceedings. This court is now in session. His voice was steady, measured. Not a flicker of anger crossed his face. But inside he was standing taller than he ever had. They remembered now. Every word. Every cuff. Every insult. Throughout the trial, Malcolm maintained professionalism. He asked questions with precision. He allowed objections with fairness. There was no vengeance in his tone, only law. The prosecutors brought evidence: body cam footage, civilian testimonies, other victims. A pattern emerged. These officers weren't just corrupt. They were predators in uniform. Malcolm watched their confidence unravel. But he never gloated. That wasn't why he was here. He was here to uphold the law, the very thing they had once used to humiliate him. And now it was wrapping around them like a net they couldn't escape. The most powerful moment came during witness testimony. A young man, barely 20, recounted how Briggs and Daniels planted a weapon on him. "I thought my life was over," he said. His voice cracked. "But then someone told me Judge Ellis was hearing the case and I had hope." The room went still. Daniels looked down. Briggs rubbed his eyes. Malcolm didn't blink. But in his heart, a fire raged. This was why he had endured. This was the moment that made every silent tear, every sleepless night, worth it. He wasn't just seeking justice. He was becoming it. When the verdict came in, guilty on all counts, Malcolm gave no speech. No dramatic statement. He simply looked at them and said, "May justice reform you more than power ever did." Then he stood, stepped down from the bench and exited. The media exploded. Headlines ran wild. Judge once arrested by cops now sentences them. But Malcolm didn't chase cameras. He returned to his chambers, closed the door and sat alone. In silence. Because justice had come full circle. And it had worn the face of the man they once tried to erase. The courtroom was quieter than usual that day. Not because it was empty, quite the opposite. It was packed with journalists, students, court watchers, and victims who had waited years for someone to hold these men accountable. But they weren't there for spectacle. They were there because of who sat at the bench. Judge Malcolm Ellis. The man whose name now echoed across legal circles, not because of scandal but because of sheer, unwavering integrity. But no one in that courtroom knew, not even the clerks, how personal this trial was for him. And yet, Malcolm carried it like he always had, with poise. The trial was swift but thorough. Prosecutors presented damning evidence. Surveillance footage, altered police reports, testimony after testimony from people who'd been falsely accused, harassed, or injured by the same two officers. But none of it was rushed. Malcolm let every side speak. He overruled and sustained objections with equal calm. The defense tried to rattle him, probing, testing for bias. But they got nothing. Malcolm didn't flinch. He asked his questions with surgical precision, never once letting his voice betray what he knew, what he remembered. He didn't need to remind them of the past. His very presence was enough. At one point, Officer Briggs took the stand. Once brash and unshakable, now sweating, voice cracking. He tried to explain away inconsistencies in his reports, claimed poor memory, blamed stress of the job. Daniels followed, even worse. He stumbled through his testimony, avoiding eye contact. And as they spoke, a few jurors glanced at Malcolm, wondering how he could sit so still, so silent, when everyone knew he had once been their victim. But that was the difference. Malcolm didn't come to settle scores. He came to set a standard. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice to wear its proper robe. The real moment came when a surprise witness stepped forward, an elderly man named Henry who had been pulled over 10 years earlier and dragged from his car by the same officers. "They said I looked suspicious," Henry said. "I was wearing a church suit." He chuckled dryly. "I was 72. My only crime was driving while black." The courtroom fell silent. Malcolm leaned forward. "And how did you feel that day?" he asked. Henry looked him in the eyes. "Like I didn't matter. Until now." The jury took note. So did everyone watching. This wasn't just a trial. It was truth in motion. Closing arguments were emotional. The prosecution didn't lean on pity, they leaned on facts. Patterns. Data. Footage. The defense tried to claim these were isolated incidents, moments of poor judgment. But the room knew better. Malcolm gave final instructions to the jury, firm, balanced, professional. Then he waited like everyone else. Hours later, the verdict was in. Guilty. On all counts. The room didn't erupt, but you could feel the air shift. People exhaled. Shoulders relaxed. For the first time in years, some believed the system could work, even when it looked broken beyond repair. But Malcolm wasn't finished. Sentencing day came. The officers stood before him, no longer armed, no longer proud. Just men facing the weight of their own actions. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You were given authority, not power. and you used it to crush instead of protect. Today's sentence isn't about destroying you. It's about showing others that no badge places anyone above the law. His words weren't sharp, they were surgical. He sentenced them to prison, but more than that, he sentenced them to live with what they had done. Their names now a permanent mark on the record. And as they were led away, shackled like the many they'd wronged, Malcolm stood and exited the courtroom without applause, without cameras. Just silence. The kind that follows when justice speaks clearly. The kind that wraps around history and echoes forward. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But in his eyes was peace, the quiet kind, earned only by those who hold power and choose not to wield it cruelly. The cycle had broken. And in that courtroom on that day, justice had a face, and it looked exactly like the man they once tried to break. The story of Judge Malcolm Ellis isn't just about poetic justice. It's about something far deeper, the power of restraint and how a man who had every reason to rage chose to rise. He didn't scream. He didn't demand headlines. He didn't break the law to avenge himself. He became the law. And in doing so, he reminded us all that justice, when done right, doesn't need vengeance to be loud. It just needs truth, time, and someone brave enough to carry it. Malcolm didn't wear his pain like a weapon. He carried it like a torch, and with it lit the path forward. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a trial, it was a transformation. The very system that once humiliated a man now stood corrected by him. It was a reckoning, not just for two officers but for everyone who ever believed power was theirs to abuse. And yet, the lesson isn't just for cops or courts. It's for all of us. When you're disrespected, dismissed, or wronged, how you respond matters. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is outgrow the very system that tried to keep you small. That's what Malcolm did. And the world watched it happen. So what about you? Have you ever witnessed someone rise from pain into purpose? A moment when karma didn't just catch up, but arrived in a suit and robe? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if this tale moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Talecraft, where stories like this come alive with every twist and turn. Because in a world where injustice often gets the spotlight, it's time we give center stage to dignity, justice, and truth. Until next time, stay strong, stay sharp, and stay human.